Good morning, it's Friday the 8th of December here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the Palestinian Prime Minister tells us his administration is in talks with the United States about a post-war plan for Gaza.
The Japanese yen surges as traders ratchet up bets that the Bank of Japan is close to calling time on negative rates.
And a premiership at risk of sinking. Could Sunak's small boats Rwanda policy capsize the Prime Minister?
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Palestinian Authority is working with US officials on a plan to run Gaza after the end of the war between Israel and Hamas. Speaking to Bloomberg, Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh says his preferred outlook would be to see Hamas as a junior partner in a post-war administration.
I think if they are ready to come to ground, to an agreement and really accept the political platform of the PLO, accept the tools of struggle, because this is an important point of difference between us and them. And then there will be a room for talk. Otherwise, it's just simply things will continue to be the same.
Mohammed Shtayyeh also told Bloomberg that he doesn't believe Hamas can be eradicated by Israel. Those comments are at odds with the stated aim of Israel's military campaign to wipe out the militant group following the October 7th attack, when some 1,200 people were killed and hundreds more were taken hostage. The subsequent war in Gaza has so far killed more than 16,000 Palestinians, according to the Hamas-run health ministry.
Well, as the war in Gaza grinds on, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to devastate Beirut if Hezbollah opens a second front in the conflict. Netanyahu delivered the warning during a visit to a command centre which oversees units that have traded fire with Hezbollah along the border with Lebanon. Here's what he said.
The people are proud of you. I also suggest to our enemies that they pay attention to this spirit, because if Hezbollah chooses to start an all-out war, then it will single-handedly turn Beirut and South Lebanon, not far from here, into Gaza and Khan Yunis.
Benjamin Netanyahu there speaking through a translator. His threat referred to the destruction that Israel's military has unleashed in the Gaza Strip in retaliation for the attack by Hamas. Hezbollah has expressed solidarity with the group, and as the fighting in Gaza has escalated, cross-border fire with Israel has become a daily occurrence.
The Japanese yen has surged over the past 24 hours as traders bet that the Bank of Japan will scrap the world's last negative interest rate regime much sooner than previously thought. The advance sent Japanese stocks and bonds lower. Former New York Fed President and Bloomberg opinion columnist Bill Dudley says ending yield curve control is a good thing.
This has been a multi-decade effort, and so if they actually manage to exit, I would take that as a very good sign. Now, obviously, that means that there'll be less liquidity coming out of Japan, but I don't think the Japanese economy and what the Bank of Japan has been doing has huge implications for global liquidity or global bond yields.
Bloomberg opinion columnist Bill Dudley speaking there after the yen jumped by almost 4% at one point against the dollar on Thursday. Markets will be watching for any clarification from Governor Kazuo Ueda of comments he made to lawmakers that his job was going to get more challenging.
Now, EU finance ministers are still scrambling to find an agreement on new fiscal rules for the bloc. After months of haggling, nations are understood to be in the final stages of negotiating a reform of the bloc's framework to limit debt and deficits. Officials had prepared for a long night of talks, but called it a day at around 3 a.m. in Brussels after a deal could not be reached. The current fiscal rules are expected to kick in again in January after being suspended to cope with the pandemic and the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
In the UK, Rishi Sunak faces a showdown with hardliners in the party over his migration bill. It's a faction that has toppled multiple Conservative leaders in recent history. The Prime Minister avoided a question on whether he'd call a general election if he loses a vote on the bill next week.
I'm confident I can get this thing done. The question is for the Labour Party. Right? We're going to get this thing into Parliament. We've introduced it in record time. I want to get it on the statute books in record time. It's very clear what we're about and what we're trying to do, and we're confident it's going to work. And my track record tells you that I can get things done.
Labour has said that they will not support Sunak's bill.
Jeremy Hunt's flagship financial reforms, meanwhile, will make no substantial change to the economy. That is the view of a report from the UK's Parliamentary Treasury Select Committee. Bloomberg's James Woolcock has more on the scathing assessment.
The plans were trailed as a big bang, an echo of Margaret Thatcher's changes to the City of London.
Well, no, they're being called the Edinburgh reforms, and they're a very ambitious set of reforms to seize on our Brexit freedoms, to deliver a smarter regulatory regime, one that's right for the circumstances we find ourselves in now, and that work in the interests of all the British people across the country.
That's City Minister Andrew Griffith on our programme 1 year ago. But instead of revamping Britain's financial sector, the Treasury Select Committee says nothing major has been achieved. They say the reforms will have zero economic impact, and some of the policies amount to little more than paper pushing. The government responded to the damning report from the Conservative-led committee, saying a year was too soon to gauge the impact of the reforms. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And move over Walmart's Waltons. Another family has emerged as the richest dynasty in the world. For the first time, Abu Dhabi's House of Nahyan joined Bloomberg's annual ranking of family fortunes. With a $305 billion fortune, the Gulf Royals took the top spot as the world's richest family. Another notable riser was the sixth-generation dynasty behind luxury brand Hermes, who added $56 billion to take the third spot. Bloomberg found that as a group, the world's richest families have gotten $1.5 trillion wealthier since the last ranking. Now, in a moment, we'll bring you more of that exclusive interview with the Palestinian Prime Minister. But first, a story that caught our eye here in the UK about how much the bank of mum and dad is really worth to young people who are buying property. New figures putting it at £25,000, the average amount of money that Britain's wealthy parents are giving to their children to buy property. These are figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Yeah, I think this just underlines the issue that the UK has with rising inequality, which has been a problem for the last decade. I mean, £25,000 I would have thought is actually quite a conservative estimate if you're trying to buy property in the southeast of England, but it just shows, and we've done a number of stories about this. You know, it's not just the bank of mum and dad, sometimes other relatives also that are being asked the difficulties of trying to live in one of the most expensive cities.
And it's the contrast between those that can afford to give their children money, which is helping them onto the property ladder, versus those that can't, and how much that's proving an obstacle for those people who, you know, given higher interest rates, the cost, of course, of paying a mortgage is much more expensive, but perhaps less said about the huge obstacle of being able to get the mortgage in the first place.
No, absolutely. I think it's it's very telling, especially as we see overall household debt to income ratios going up so much. Yeah, it's a real point that I think is becoming increasingly political.
Well, let's bring you more now of our exclusive interview with the Palestinian Prime Minister. In the broad-ranging conversation with our Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner, Mohammed Shtaya discusses his recent meetings with US officials, how the Palestinian Authority wants to be involved in rebuilding Gaza when the war ends, and his hopes for an opportunity for a peace agreement establishing a Palestinian state. Take a listen now to some of that interview.
Gaza is an integral part of the state of Palestine.
Right.
And the Palestinian territory includes Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem. So when we talk about two states, the geography of the two states is Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank.
Of course.
So this integral part of the Palestinian territory should always be there. And
but is there a fear of going in after this operation by Israel, that you're sort of following in on their tanks? Is that a concern?
We said that we are not going to go there on an Israeli military.
But what does it mean?
It means that for us, there has to be an arrangement. Our people are there, and we need to put together a structure, and we need to put together a mechanism. This is something that we are working on with the international community in order for us to make it possible. There will be huge needs in terms of relief, reconstruction, to remedy the wounds. And
are you ready to take that on?
Not by ourselves. I mean, obviously, we need international assistance.
But this is your plan. Your plan is that the PA would, when this thing ends, be the kind of vehicle for rebuilding Gaza?
By all means. Look, when Israel incurged into Gaza in 2014, who did all the reconstruction? We. And we were still reconstructing Gaza. Most of aspects of infrastructure has been actually built by the Palestinian Authority. And even before the war, I should tell you that there were under implementation a total value of $800 million of infrastructure projects that has been under implementation by us.
Yes.
Roads, hospitals, water networks, electricity, desalination plants, and so on. So we, as I told you, we never abandoned Gaza. We never left Gaza. So now, any day after, it should also include a package of assistance with the full engagement of the international community, because ourselves, we cannot do it alone.
The relationship between the PA and Hamas is very complicated. There was, after all, a civil war, as you said, in 2007. But the Israelis say they want to eradicate Hamas. Is that a goal that is achievable? Can you do it?
First of all, we tried 4 times or more to come to an agreement with Hamas.
And it didn't work.
And correct. And we signed 4 agreements. Unfortunately, none of them was ever implemented.
By them?
By them. And recently we have had a dialogue in Egypt and Al Alamein, and we agreed on certain issues. We did disagree on a number of issues, and we did form a committee to keep them engaged. Mm-hmm. That was the idea. But unfortunately, all these sort of things has happened, and then now things are going in a totally different direction. Now, for Israel to say that they are going to eradicate or eliminate Hamas, I don't think that's a possible goal to achieve, simply because Hamas is not in Gaza only. Hamas is in Lebanon, Hamas in leadership, everybody knows, in Qatar, and they are here in the West Bank, and so on and so forth. So what is needed really is a situation in which that Palestinian unity should be allowed to function on very clear bonds and agenda. We did put together certain bonds for Hamas to accept. They never accepted,
right,
including recognition of international legitimacy, United Nations resolutions, BLO commitments, and so on and so forth. We even invited Hamas to become part of the Palestine Liberation Organization. They never wanted to. Mm-hmm. Hamas wanted to take things their own way, mm-hmm, either their way or the highway, and it seems that we are on the highway. So that is where the situation is. Now, as I said, whether Israel will be able to achieve what they are claiming to do, I doubt that.
But on the other hand, and in no way to say that you are in favor of what's happening, the suppression of Hamas ultimately needs to happen in some way. If they're not going to come into the PLO, if they're not going to forswear their armed struggle and join in some international legitimacy, what needs to happen with Hamas? What can you see happening?
Well, I think Hamas before October 7 is one thing, and Hamas after is another.
That's a very
thing.
good point. And
therefore, I think if they are ready to come to ground, to an agreement, and really accept the political platform of the PLO, accept the tools of struggle, because this is an important point of difference between us and them. And then there will be a room for talk. Otherwise, it's just simply things will continue to be the same. And even Palestinians should not be divided. We have been divided, unfortunately. Hamas took over Gaza by force in 2007, and this should not have lasted for 17 years. But obviously they were enjoying it there, and they were enjoying some sort of political safety net, funding, other issues that has kept them for 17 years, including the strategy of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, because we knew and we know that Netanyahu's strategy was to keep Gaza totally away from the rest of the Palestinian territory in an attempt to kill every possibility of a Palestinian state.
That was the Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh there, speaking to Bloomberg's Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner. And Ethan joins us now for more. Ethan, is this a realistic plan from the Palestinian Prime Minister for governing Gaza after the war?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Look, there are no realistic plans right now. In every direction you look, you see an enormous obstacle. The idea that there has to be a Palestinian administrative force in charge of a group of Palestinians in Gaza makes enormous sense. Now, what the Prime Minister is saying is that after what goes on now, after the 7th of October and the war that follows, that Hamas will perhaps be a chastened group with a slightly different leadership, more willing to join the PLO in its acceptance of the legitimacy of Israel. Of course, the whole idea of Hamas from its birth in the late 80s was precisely because it refused ever to recognize the legitimacy of Israel. So, it's an enormous change that he's thinking is going to happen. They've tried for years to bring them into the PLO and have failed. So it doesn't look very likely. On the other hand, the Israeli argument that we're going to destroy Hamas and it will never exist again also seems unrealistic to most people who look at it. So there we are.
Yeah. And I thought it was a fascinating interview to simply understand, the difficulties that Mohammed Shtayyeh is in. Also, he's also highly critical of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Did you get the impression that this Palestinian leadership could actually negotiate with Israel?
Well, with an Israel, but with this Israel, it doesn't seem at all likely. I mean, they all despise one another right now. It's also true that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his very right-wing government is openly opposed to a Palestinian state, which is the whole goal of the Palestinian Authority. So, there's a lot of tension there. So I can't really see that happening. Now, it's also fair to imagine that when this war ends at a certain point, there will be perhaps new elections in Israel and perhaps a slightly different set of characters in charge, and that could make a difference. But I mean, I think we're in a very, very difficult place, which is why there is so much destruction underway.
Mohammed Shtayyeh still did emphasise how invested the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is in Gaza as well, talking about the employees that they still have working there as well. He also seemed optimistic about the idea that perhaps a crisis could leave an opening for a bigger peace negotiation. Talk us through what he had to say about that.
Yes. So on the first point, this is the case. I mean, it's hard for everyone to keep in mind the history, but between the mid-90s and 2007, when Hamas threw the Palestinian Authority out, the Palestinian Authority ran Gaza as it did the West Bank. And it had 25, 30,000, 40,000 employees left there when it was thrown out, and kept paying them. Now, some of them kept working in the health ministry and the schools. The security forces, some 20,000 of them, just stayed home and got paid for the last 15 or 17 years. So what he's saying is, look, we have people on the ground. This is not foreign territory to us. We can get going right away. So that's the idea of that. In terms of there being a kind of international conference to establish peace between Israel and the Palestinians, that's an idea that the Palestinians have pushed for many, many years because they feel impotent alone against the Israelis. The Israelis have always rejected it because they consider the international community to be too hostile, much of it, especially at the UN. And it has been a non-starter. And by the way, it's also true that what the Palestinian Prime Minister wants is full membership for the Palestinian Authority, for the state of Palestine in the UN, something which the U.S. Congress has specifically voted against. So, as I say, a lot of no exit signs in all directions.
On a last but very important point, we've also been hearing and played for you the clip of the Israeli Prime Minister speaking in Hebrew, making this direct threat to Hezbollah that Israel would turn Beirut and southern Lebanon into Gaza and Khan Yunis if it opened an all-out war. In your assessment, Ethan, how much of a risk, how much are people thinking about that now?
Well, this is an enormous risk. This is something the Israeli leadership has said from day one, since October 7th, that if Hezbollah thinks it's going to start raining down missiles on Israel and join Hamas in this war, that it is going to, and it has used those exact words, turn Beirut into Gaza City. So a good portion of the Israeli Air Force is up north in Israel, ready to face southern Lebanon, and enormous damage would be done, which I think is probably understood by Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and by the leadership there. And one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, it has not become more involved in this war.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.